Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a monumental stack of sources, articles, historical analyses, and some new archival discoveries, and drilling straight down into, well, the single most defining political scandal of the American 20th century, Watergate.
It really is more than just a scandal, isn't it? It's a political watershed moment.
Yeah.
We're talking about a story that has everything.
Huh.
Paranoia, systemic abuse of power, incredibly dedicated investigative journalism, and a total constitutional crisis that led to the only presidential resignation in U.S. history.
Exactly.
And what's truly fascinating as we look at this collected material is that the story, it keeps evolving. We're no longer just talking about a third-rate burglary as they tried to frame it. We're looking at a massive kind of interconnected network of criminality that actually predated the break-in itself.
Yeah, that's a key point in these sources. Our material today details not just the complex timeline, but the personalities, the internal White House mechanics, and the long-lasting institutional wound that Watergate inflicted on the whole American system. Our mission isn't simply to review the famous dates, which, let's face it, many people know, but to genuinely dig into the mindset of the men involved, the specific mechanics of the cover-up, and, those often forgotten consequences for the people and institutions that got tangled up in this whole political web.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We should probably start at the accepted starting point, even if it's a
Okay.
bit superficial. That's the early morning of June 17th, 1972. 5 men are caught red-handed inside the Democratic National Committee, the DNC headquarters. This is in the Watergate apartment and office complex in Washington, D.C. Pretty fancy place.
Right. And they weren't exactly subtle about it. Wearing business suits, carrying walkie-talkies, cameras, thousands of dollars in sequential bills, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. And the sources note that the crime was almost instantly and frankly quite clumsily connected back to the highest levels of the Republican administration. One of the men arrested, James McCord, was the security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president.
Better known by its famously unfortunate acronym, CREAKY.
Yes, creep. And worse, detectives found key White House phone numbers and links to E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA operative and White House consultant, among the burglars' belongings. It was just sloppy.
So that direct link right there to CREEP and the White House, that was the initial spark, right? The first real fire?
It was. But the White House immediately tried to smother it. The documents show that President Nixon, believing his overwhelming re-election was basically in the bag just a few months away, initially dismissed the entire event internally. He assessed, I think the quote is, that it was going to be forgotten.
Wow. And that initial assessment, that dismissal of what was clearly a major political espionage crime as simply a third-rate burglary attempt, that was the launchpad for the entire cover-up, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was built on this foundation of just absolute denial and really a total misjudgment of the American press and the judicial system.
If they had just let it go.
Precisely. If they had simply allowed a low-level investigation of a clumsy burglary to proceed, maybe the story dies down. But their immediate instinct was to cover it up, to lie, and to deploy the power of the White House itself to halt the investigation. That's what ballooned it into a constitutional catastrophe.
Okay, so to understand why the most powerful man in the world would risk everything, his entire presidency, over what seems like a botched burglary, we have to rewind, like significantly before June 1972. We need to explore what these sources call the deep root system of paranoia and political warfare that really defined the Nixon White House. And that starts with Richard Nixon himself, doesn't it? His biography, his political character.
It absolutely does. The sources are extremely helpful here. They frame the scandal not as some kind of aberration, but as maybe the inevitable climax of Nixon's political pathology. His entire political life, you look back, it was characterized by these hard-fought, ruthless
The
campaigns.
Shrieky Dick, that was the nickname he earned early on.
Exactly. Think about his early career, his defeat of Jerry Voorhees, his really aggressive campaign against Helen Gahogan Douglas, calling her the Pink Lady.
Right.
And, of course, the incredibly public and nationally defining pursuit of Alger Hiss. He made his name as an anti-communist crusader.
And those early triumphs, especially his knack for using political confrontation effectively, it seems like that cemented a specific and really deeply ingrained worldview in him.
He came to believe he was perpetually under attack. Even after winning the presidency, the highest office, he privately defined his opposition, which he seemed to see everywhere, as elites, Jews, the left, and the press. He felt constantly victimized by this powerful, entrenched establishment,
Even from the Oval Office.
especially from the Oval Office. That sense of victimhood, even from the absolute apex of power, that's the engine of the scandal, isn't it? When you genuinely believe that shadowy, powerful forces are conspiring to destroy you, which, by all accounts, Nixon did, you can rationalize almost anything as self-defense.
So the ends justify the means.
Completely. This allowed him to embrace that sort of Machiavellian idea that the end justifies the means to combat what he saw as a genuine conspiracy against his legitimate administration. The sources note this conviction, coupled with his famously, well, gruff persona and these deeply entrenched character issues, created an environment where illegality wasn't just tolerated, it was justified internally as necessary warfare.
Wow.
He reportedly told his aides at one point with really startling clarity, something like, "We're up against an enemy, a conspiracy. They're using any means. We are going to use any means. Is that clear?"
Wait. So the White House was operating under a military paradigm, viewing domestic political opposition Americans as an enemy of the state. That level of official paranoia is just staggering.
It is, and it confirms the source's finding that Watergate wasn't a single isolated event. It was the culmination of what they call a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage. We really need to look at the precursor crimes that set the stage.
Okay, where does that start?
Well, the crucial catalyst, the moment the paranoia really metastasized into organized crime, was almost exactly a year before the Watergate break-in, June 1971. This was the leak of the Pentagon Papers.
Daniel Ellsberg.
Daniel Ellsberg, yeah. The defense analyst who released this massive secret history of the Vietnam War to the press. For Nixon, this was proof positive. It confirmed his deepest suspicions. The executive branch itself, which he felt was still full of Democrats from previous administrations, was actively betraying him.
And this betrayal led directly to the creation of the infamous White House plumbers, right? This secret unit set up to plug leaks and conduct investigations, basically off the books.
Exactly. And their first major act, long before the DNC burglary, was the September 1971 break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in Beverly Hills.
They were looking for dirt.
Precisely. A direct attempt by G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, the same guys central to Watergate, to find any damaging personal information on Ellsberg that they could leak to discredit him in the public eye.
It's incredible. And what's crucial to grasp here, I think, is the mindset of the operatives they recruited for this kind of internal war. Like G. Gordon Liddy, he seems to personify this ruthless and justifies the means approach.
Oh, absolutely. Liddy, a former FBI agent, Army veteran, he was specifically recruited by White House counsel John Dean to develop campaign intelligence plans, or, what we would now call organized political sabotage.
And the scope of his proposals was truly terrifying, wasn't it? The sources detail how Liddy was known for these really outrageous and controversial suggestions that even his immediate White House colleagues, people like Dean and Mitchell, had to try and ignore or shut down.
We're not talking about petty theft here.
No.
We're talking about comprehensive state-sponsored terror, practically. Liddy proposed detailed plans, sometimes under the code name Operation Gemstone, that included suggestions like, well, assassinating political enemies through staged accidents.
Sure.
Yes. Kidnapping key war protesters and maybe drugging them, rendering them to Mexico during the Republican National Convention so they couldn't disrupt it.
Yeah.
And even firebombing the Brookings Institution, a left-leaning think tank.
Why Brookings?
They believe Brookings was storing classified documents related to the Pentagon Papers, maybe some that Ellsberg hadn't leaked. And Nixon himself actually ordered the institution to be burglarized to retrieve them. It was an order from the president. It ultimately proved too difficult to execute, but the order was given.
The sheer dissonance of a team inside the White House entertaining bombing a domestic policy think tank is just mind-boggling.
It shows the White House was functionally operating outside the law well before the DNC break-in even happened.
Okay, let's focus a bit more on Liddy, because his character seems pivotal here. He was eventually convicted, right? Conspiracy, burglary, illegal wiretapping.
Yep. And he was the only one of the original 7 defendants who refused to testify before the Senate committee, citing his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. He literally went to prison, stayed silent, for his commander-in-chief.
And he paid a heavy price for that silence.
He did. Served 4 years and 4 months in prison, including, I think, over 100 days in solitary confinement. But the most remarkable part of his narrative, maybe, is his absolute defiant lack of remorse afterwards.
He became a talk show host, right?
Yeah, a highly controversial but incredibly popular radio talk show host after his release. a provocateur who basically made his prison time a badge of honor. He wrote books, consulted on security, even had an acting career. You might remember him as a villain in shows like Miami Vice.
He really leaned into it.
He absolutely did. His legacy is that of an operative who internalized the mission and just never broke faith.
Mm.
Years later, he maintained absolute loyalty to Nixon. He reportedly told interviewers he would do it again for my president.
Wow.
He even claimed in a 60 Minutes interview, I believe, that Nixon's major failing wasn't the crime itself, but that he was insufficiently ruthless, suggesting Nixon should have just destroyed the tape recordings immediately. Liddy truly embodied the dark, unwavering ethos of political warfare that defined that administration.
Okay, so we have the systemic crimes, the illegal operations, and the criminal mindset that enabled them. But the whole effort eventually failed, didn't it? Because the institutional checks, the media, the judiciary, and Congress, they eventually that institutional response. It wasn't immediate, though. You mentioned Nixon's early denial, calling it a third-rate burglary. Initially, the White House PR campaign was surprisingly effective, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Most major media outlets, even the network news channels, seemed to consider the story of sort of marginal importance, especially
Yeah.
with Nixon heading toward that landslide re-election victory in November '72. The cover-up had room to breathe at first.
But the Washington Post was the monumental exception.
Absolutely. Our sources indicate that between the June 17th break-in and the end of 1972, the Post published an astonishing 200 front-page stories on Watergate. Just think about that number.
That's incredible dedication.
It is. To put it in perspective, their closest national competitor, the New York Times, published less than half that amount during the same period. The Post just wouldn't let it go.
And Woodward and Bernstein, the reporters, they became genuine household names. Their method really defined a new era of investigative journalism, didn't it? This idea of incremental reporting, taking one step at a time, day after day.
That's exactly right. They weren't necessarily looking for one single explosive headline every day. They were building this continuous narrative of corruption, piece by painstaking piece. The long-term influence of their work, and especially the book, All the President's Men, was just immense. It's been called perhaps the most influential piece of journalism in history.
And that incremental reporting, that digging, it eventually yielded undeniable financial proof connecting the burglars to the campaign, right? The Dahlberg check.
Yes, the Dahlberg check. That surfaced in August 1972. Investigators discovered that a massive $25,000 cashier's check, which was part of over $100,000 in campaign funds that had been sneakily laundered through various accounts in Mexico, was deposited directly into the bank account of one of the burglars, Bernard L. Barker.
That single check, that transaction, it just exploded the White House narrative, didn't it?
Completely. It proved the break-in wasn't the work of some zealots operating independently, as the White House kept claiming. It was centrally funded, managed, and controlled by the campaign. By creep, the money trail was the first concrete thing that couldn't just be explained away by spin.
And of course, underpinning their reporting was the mysterious source, Deep Throat.
Ah, yes, Deep Throat. Vital. Providing crucial assurance, context, confirming leads at critical junctures. That source, who we now know since 2005, was FBI Deputy Director Mark Felt.
Right, number 2 at the FBI.
Exactly. He was positioned perfectly within the Justice Department to confirm the accuracy of tips they were getting, and, perhaps most importantly, to confirm that the FBI's own investigation was being actively, deliberately stymied by the White House. The sources suggest that once Felt's identity was known, it became almost obvious in retrospect only a top FBI official could have provided that kind of detailed institutional insight into the obstruction.
While Woodward and Bernstein were chasing the political money trail, there was a very human tragedy playing out in real time. And the press also played a role in bringing that to light. The story of Martha Mitchell.
Oh, Martha Mitchell, a fascinating and tragic figure. She was the flamboyant wife of Attorney General John Mitchell, who, remember, also headed CREEP.
The Mouth of the South.
That was her nickname, yeah. A celebrity socialite known for speaking maybe too frankly to the press. She had been suspicious and vocal about wrongdoing from the very start, even before the break-in, and the sources paint a really dark picture of her attempt to blow the whistle.
What happened?
Immediately after the DNC break-in, she was allegedly held hostage for days in a California hotel room by her husband's security detail. Reports claim she was physically assaulted, forcibly sedated with tranquilizers to keep her from calling reporters she knew.
Held hostage by her husband's people. to silence her.
That's the story. Her story is crucial because she was silenced not by political opponents, but by the very people closest to the cover-up. She represents the intense pressure, the ruthlessness, and the real human cost exacted by that White House paranoia. And when she did try to speak out later, the administration dismissed her claims as the rantings of a mentally unstable alcoholic woman, which further eroded public trust when the truth eventually, inevitably, came out.
So the media sets the stage, lays the groundwork, then the judicial branch delivers the first massive structural crack in the cover-up.
Yes, and that came through the courtroom of Judge John J. Sirica. He was the chief judge of the U.S. District Court for D.C., who presided over the initial trial of the Watergate burglars, nicknamed Maximum John for his tough sentencing.
And Sirica wasn't just a judge, he was paying attention, right?
He was a very careful observer. He had reportedly read every single Washington Post story on Watergate and was deeply convinced that there was a larger conspiracy, something bigger that hadn't been exposed yet in his courtroom.
And his skepticism was vindicated.
Completely. In March 1973, James McCord, one of the convicted burglars, the former CIA operative, wrote Judge Sirica a letter from jail.
What did it say?
McCord stated explicitly that the defendants had been subjected to political pressure to plead guilty and, crucially, to commit perjury to lie under oath about the involvement of high-ranking administration officials. This was the moment the cover-up narrative became legally unsustainable.
Wow. And how did Sirica handle that bombshell?
With absolute judicial brilliance, really. He read the letter aloud in open court, confirming the existence of this pressure. Then, instead of just accepting the guilty pleas as they stood, he handed down what he called provisional sentences. And they were exceptionally long sentences, up to 40 years in some cases, to the defendants.
40 years. Provisionally.
Exactly. This was the strategic leverage that, as the sources say, broke the case wide open. He essentially told the defendants, "Your current sentences are catastrophic, but they become potentially manageable the moment you start cooperating fully and truthfully with the grand jury or the Senate committee that was forming."
So it wasn't just punishment, it was a strategically placed legal key.
Precisely. It immediately incentivized key players like McCord and eventually others to flip and testify against the higher-ups in the White House. The dam had officially burst.
Speaking of the Senate, the legislative branch followed swiftly, didn't they? And with a rare display of institutional unity.
Astonishing unity, really. In February 1973, reflecting the mounting evidence and McCord's revelations, the Senate voted unanimously, 77-0, to establish the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, better known as the Senate Watergate Committee.
77-0, to investigate a sitting president.
Yeah. A bipartisan consensus like that, especially with members of the president's own party voting to investigate him, is virtually unheard of today, according to pretty much every political source we have.
And the Senate hearings themselves, starting in May 73, they became this national spectacle, right? Educating the public in real time about how corruption worked at that level.
Well, absolutely. They were televised live, gavel to gavel by the three major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. Public television aired replays in the evening, ensuring maximum reach. Estimates suggest something like 85% of American households tuned in to watch at least some of the 300-plus hours of televised testimony. It was a shared national moment of, civic education.
And the committee's leadership was key to its credibility too, wasn't it?
Hugely important. It was chaired by the widely beloved and respected constitutional expert Senator Sam Ervin, a Democrat from North Carolina. He had this persona of a simple country lawyer, but he was an absolute titan of constitutional law.
And the vice chairman was a Republican.
Yes, Senator Howard Baker, a Republican from Tennessee. This bipartisan leadership lent the investigation immense credibility from the start.
And the hearings really took off when John Dean testified, didn't they? The former White House legal counsel.
Went nuclear is probably the right term. John Dean, remember the man who was initially directed to develop those campaign intelligence plans, testified for days. He meticulously detailed the entire conspiracy from the inside. He provided explosive testimony implicating former Attorney General John Mitchell, top Nixon aides H.R. Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman. And crucially, Dean testified that he had personally warned President Nixon that the cover-up was becoming a cancer on the presidency.
Direct implication of the president.
Direct implication. And then Senator Baker, the Republican vice chair, cemented his place in history with the question that became the unofficial motto of the entire investigation, the question everyone wanted answered. What did the president know, and when did he know it?
That question just hung over everything.
It did. Baker, who was initially loyal to Nixon, he famously told the president early on, "I'm your friend." But he listened carefully during the hearings. He questioned witnesses rigorously, and ultimately he realized the corruption was systemic. His willingness as a Republican to pursue the truth wherever it led, despite his party affiliation, provided the essential moral backbone to the inquiry.
So the pressure is mounting from the media, the courts, the Senate, but the whole scandal reached its absolute irreversible tipping point on a seemingly innocuous day in July 1973 during those Senate hearings.
And this involved what might be the greatest, most profound irony of the entire affair. The very means by which Richard Nixon sought to preserve his legacy became the singular tool of his destruction.
You're talking about the tapes.
The tapes. The revelation came from a former Nixon aide named Alexander Butterfield. Committee investigators had received a tip. Apparently it came from Woodward, who likely got it from Deep Throat, Mark felt, that there might be recordings. When Butterfield was questioned under oath, sort of routinely, he disclosed the shocking existence of a secret, voice-activated taping system hidden in the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, and at Camp David.
Nixon had it installed himself.
Yes. Nixon himself had directed its installation back in February 1971.
Why? Why would he do that?
Think about the audacity, the hubris perhaps. Nixon, the historian, the statesman in his own mind, wanted the tapes for his file. He was convinced they would be invaluable evidence for his future memoirs, proving his decisiveness, his brilliance behind the scenes. He told aides the tapes were strictly for posterity and, crucially, would not be transcribed by anyone else. He literally created a secret, real-time audio archive of his own potentially criminal conversations and the subsequent cover-up.
It's almost unbelievable. And suddenly, the entire political dynamic just shifted on a dime, didn't it?
Completely. Every single conversation John Dean had testified about, every moment of plotting, every potentially illegal directive, it could theoretically be confirmed or denied by the physical record. Nixon's word, his denials, were now weighed against a literal, recorded history of events.
And naturally, he refused to turn them over.
Of course. He cited the doctrine of executive privilege, claimed national security concerns, setting up the ultimate constitutional crisis, Congress and the courts versus the president.
That refusal led directly to the shocking sequence of events that became known as the Saturday Night Massacre in October 1973, right?
Exactly. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, who had been appointed by the Justice Department to investigate the whole Watergate matter independently, issued a subpoena demanding specific recordings.
Right.
Nixon refused, offering summaries that were, highly edited and curated by the White House.
Which Cox rejected.
Immediately rejected. He demanded the actual tapes. Nixon then ordered Cox fired.
And what followed was just this stunning display of institutional integrity within the Justice Department.
It really was. Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused, citing the agreement he'd made with the Senate during his confirmation hearings that Cox would have full independence, and he immediately resigned in protest.
Then Nixon turned to the Deputy Attorney General,
William Ruckelshaus, who also refused to carry out the order and resigned on the spot as well. Two top officials gone in one night.
So the order finally fell to whom?
Solicitor General Robert Bork, the third highest-ranking official at the Justice Department. Bork, under immense pressure, reluctantly executed the firing. He later stated he did it primarily to prevent the entire Justice Department leadership from being wiped out, which could have potentially handed the investigation back over to the White House itself. But this sequence of resignations and the firing of the special prosecutor in one single weekend, it cemented the public perception that the White House was actively obstructing justice and trying to destroy the constitutional checks on its power. It looked terrible.
Even after the massacre, though, the legal pressure just kept mounting, didn't it?
Really?
Relentlessly through 1974.
Oh, yeah. The system was working, even with setbacks. In March of '74, a grand jury indicted 7 former top Nixon aides for their roles in the cover-up. People like Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell. But they went a massive step further.
Naming Nixon himself.
They named Richard Nixon himself as an unindicted co-conspirator. Think about that. The sitting president of the United States, officially recognized by a grand jury as being involved in organized criminal activity related to the cover-up.
That's unprecedented. Then came the final legal showdown over the tapes.
The big one. On July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously, in the landmark case, United States v. Nixon. The court decreed that the president must surrender the subpoenaed tapes to the new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, who had replaced Cox.
A unanimous decision against the president on executive privilege.
Huge. This ruling was an enormous constitutional precedent. It clearly established the legal limits of executive privilege, affirming that no person, not even the president, is completely above the law when it comes to criminal evidence.
So the game was definitively over at that point.
Pretty much. The tapes had to be released. And on August 5, 1974, Nixon, complying with the Supreme Court order, released the transcripts, including the one conversation that historians and the press instantly labeled the smoking gun.
And this wasn't just some vague, ambiguous conversation, was it?
Not at all. The smoking gun tape was from June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the Watergate break-in. In it, the President of the United States is clearly heard instructing his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, to order the FBI to halt its investigation immediately.
Using the CIA as an excuse.
Yes, using the CIA as a pretext, claiming bogus national security concerns related to the Bay of Pigs or something. The specific dialogue is just chilling. Haldeman suggests the FBI be told, look, the problem is that this tracks back to the Bay of Pigs, and it's likely to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing. And Nixon's reply is a clear instruction to obstruct justice.
All right, just say, don't go any further into this case, period.
Wow,
Yeah.
Undeniable. That recording provided the undeniable evidence of his direct complicity in the cover-up, right from the very beginning. It proved he was involved in the conspiracy just days after the break-in occurred. The political support he had desperately clung to, even among the staunchest Republicans in Congress, it just instantly collapsed. The jig was well and truly up.
So with the smoking gun tape now public, the political calculation for Nixon shifted dramatically, didn't it? From desperate defense to just simple survival.
Exactly. The House Judiciary Committee had already, even before the tape release, researched and adopted 3 articles of impeachment against him: obstruction of justice, abuse of presidential powers, and contempt of Congress for hindering the impeachment process itself by defying subpoenas.
So his prospects for avoiding impeachment by the full House and then subsequent conviction by the Senate, they were gone.
Instantly judged to be almost non-existent. The sources cite this poignant, if absolutely devastating moment. Republican Senator Barry Goldwater, a true icon of the conservative movement, someone Nixon might have hoped would stand by him, had to personally go to the White House and deliver the painful news. He told Nixon he had lost essentially all political capital on Capitol Hill and that his chances of survival were 0.
Goldwater told him he had maybe, 15 votes in the Senate?
Something like that, yeah. Not nearly enough to avoid conviction and removal. So facing certain removal from office, Richard Nixon went on national television on the evening of August 8, 1974, and announced his resignation, effective at noon the next day.
Making him the first and still the only U.S. president to resign from office.
The only one. And in that farewell speech, it's interesting, he famously skirted any direct admission of guilt regarding the scandal itself. He framed it not as a legal necessity, but as a political calculation. He said he wasn't a quitter, but simply lacked the strong enough political base in Congress to govern effectively anymore.
And he focused on foreign policy in the end, didn't he?
Almost entirely. The sources point out that his final words in office focused heavily on his foreign policy accomplishments: opening relations with China, achieving détente with the Soviet Union, ending the Vietnam War. It was clearly an attempt to salvage his historical legacy by pointing to the things he considered truly important, far away from the mess of domestic espionage and cover-ups.
But the scandal didn't just end with his helicopter lifting off the White House lawn. There was still a major piece to come.
The pardon. Just 6 weeks later, on September 8, 1974, his successor, Gerald Ford, who had been Nixon's vice president, granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he had committed or may have committed while in office.
And that pardon was immediately and intensely polarizing. Right.
Immensely polarizing. Ford clearly intended it, or at least said he intended it, to help heal the body politic, allow the country to move past the trauma of Watergate. But polls showed twice as many Americans disapproved as approved in the immediate aftermath. The criticism really centered on that core principle of equality under the law.
Because Nixon's own men went to jail.
Exactly. And that criticism still holds weight when you compare the fates of the conspirators. The men who carried out Nixon's illegal orders, former Attorney General John Mitchell, Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, Chief Domestic Advisor John Ehrlichman, among others, they were all tried, convicted, and served prison time. Sentences between 18 and 21 months for the top guys.
Yet the man who gave the illegal orders, the architect of the whole conspiracy,
walked free, without ever facing a trial, without serving a single day in prison. And significantly, Nixon never admitted criminal wrongdoing. He only ever admitted to poor judgment.
Which is a critical factor in the historical debate, isn't it? That lack of a legal reckoning.
It is. As one source noted, critics worried deeply at the time, and still do, that the precedent set was that everyone knows Nixon committed crimes, and yet he is not to be punished. Does that suggest a dangerous path toward criminal impunity for future presidents? That's the question that lingers.
Before we dive fully into the legacy, we have to mention someone who often gets overlooked, maybe the most poignant, forgotten figure in the whole scandal. The man who literally started it all by just doing his job, Frank Wills.
Ah, Frank Wills, yes. The 24-year-old security guard working the graveyard shift at the Watergate complex that night.
He was the one who discovered the break-in, wasn't he? Early that morning, June 17th, 1972, he noticed masking tape placed over the latch of a door leading from the garage into the building, into the DNC offices.
Right. He removed the tape, thought maybe it was maintenance, but then he found the same latch taped over again just an hour later, realized something was seriously wrong, highly suspicious, and he called the police. His simple attention to detail, doing his job properly, launched the investigation that eventually brought down a presidency.
He played this monumental, if maybe accidental, role in American history that night. Yet, when all the dust settled, when the accolades were handed out and the huge legal battles concluded, Wills was left with basically nothing.
It's quite tragic. He only received a minimal $2.50 a week raise after the event. He was denied a promotion he requested. And then, when he was laid off about a year later, he apparently struggled to get financial support.
The sources really convey the immense tragedy of his disillusionment. He briefly got some fame. He played himself in the 1976 movie version of All the President's Men, which put him in the spotlight for a moment. But afterwards, he struggled financially for the rest of his life, working odd jobs, often unable to maintain consistent employment.
Yeah, he eventually ended up back in South Carolina, caring for his elderly mother, reportedly impoverished and deeply frustrated. The sources share his sad reflection near the end of his life. He felt he never received anything for my role in the infamous Watergate scandal and stated that he had lost faith entirely in the political system. He felt used and then just completely ignored by the very country he had, in his own small way, helped save from corruption. His story is just a stark reminder of the immense human cost of political upheaval, even for those who act heroically at the lowest levels.
Okay, so as painful as the immediate fallout was for individuals like Frank Wills, Watergate quickly became this pivotal hinge in American history, didn't it? Shaping law, politics, and culture for decades to come. Let's talk about that lasting legacy, maybe starting with the constitutional impact.
It had massive, enduring constitutional significance at practically every turn. That Supreme Court ruling, United States v. Nixon, was absolutely critical. It affirmed, really for the first time in over a century, with such clarity that executive privilege is not absolute. It established that the president, while possessing certain privileges related to confidential advice, cannot withhold evidence that is demonstrably relevant and essential to a criminal proceeding. That check on presidential power remains bedrock constitutional law today.
And the public exposure itself was transformative, wasn't it? Just seeing how things worked or didn't work.
Hugely transformative. The release of those Nixon tape transcripts, filled with all the plotting, the profanity, the really crass discussion of political enemies, it utterly shocked the nation. People just weren't prepared for that side of the presidency. The sources argue this singular event significantly diminished the character of the presidency in the public eye. Americans simply couldn't reconcile the public image of the stern, formal statesman with the, frankly, venomous, petty, and often insecure planner captured on those recordings.
And the Senate investigation, it didn't just expose wrongdoing, it spurred actual legislative reforms aimed directly at preventing future abuses of power, right? Increasing government transparency.
Yes, that's a crucial outcome. Congress, operating under that powerful, if temporary, bipartisan consensus, moved quickly. They revised the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, in 1974, giving the public and the media vastly expanded tools to access executive branch documents and information.
And the Sunshine Act.
They also passed the Government and Sunshine Act of 1976, which mandated that federal agencies, boards, and commissions had to hold their decision-making meetings in public, open to observation. These legislative actions were direct institutional remedies designed to counter the kind of secrecy, paranoia, and internal plotting that had defined the Nixon White House. They were trying to build guardrails.
Now, what's often overlooked, or maybe just completely overshadowed by the sheer weight of the scandal, is the genuinely paradoxical nature of Nixon's administration when it comes to domestic achievement.
It's a huge paradox. It's easy to let the crimes completely dominate the historical narrative, and understandably so. But the sources do remind us of some significant policy accomplishments that were happening concurrently with, the Palmers breaking into psychiatrists' offices.
It's the ultimate political irony, isn't it? The same administration engaging in this systemic criminality was simultaneously responsible for major environmental and social advancements.
It really is. The Nixon administration created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. They successfully enacted the Clean Air Act of 1970. These are foundational pieces of modern American environmental regulation signed into law by Richard Nixon.
And social spending, too.
He was actually a massive proponent of increased social spending, surprisingly for a Republican of that era. He increased federal spending for the poor, the aged, and the handicapped. Furthermore, he showed, maybe surprising, political outreach and responsiveness to certain minority groups. He nearly doubled the budget for Native American programs compared to the previous administration, reflecting a genuine, if perhaps politically calculated, responsiveness with presidential gestures toward tribes.
And Hispanic Americans as well.
Yeah, he also reached out significantly to Hispanic Americans, made something like 55 appointments to significant policy positions, compared to only 9 in the previous 2 administrations combined. The selection of Romana Acosta Banuelos as Treasurer of the United States in 1971 is a prime example of that outreach. The duality is just staggering. A president who demonstrably advanced environmental protection and certain aspects of social justice while simultaneously dismantling democratic norms through political espionage and obstruction.
Despite those achievements, though, the scandal remains the dominant historical feature. And one of the most intensely debated aspects of that scandal remains Gerald Ford's pardon, which seems to take on new relevance today, doesn't it?
It really does. While Ford certainly intended it, or stated his intention was to unify the country and move on, the sources confirmed that many historians and legal scholars now argue that the absence of a full legal reckoning, allowing the architect of the crime to escape accountability, set a deeply dangerous precedent. A precedent of potential criminal impunity for both sitting and former presidents.
That lack of a trial, specifically.
That lack of a trial, the legal scholars argue, came at a colossal cost to the country's commitment to the rule of law. It perhaps created an expectation, or at least a fear, that the presidency or even the former presidency was somehow too big to jail, too important to be subjected to the same legal processes as anyone else.
So the argument is that a trial would have sent a clearer signal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Many historians now argue that a public trial, regardless of the outcome, would have provided the clear signal that law-breaking at the absolute highest level would not be tolerated, a point that is continuously and currently being emphasized by the ongoing legal questions surrounding former presidents today. The debate around the pardon has shifted, perhaps, less about Ford's motives and more about its unintended, long-term institutional consequences for accountability.
Okay, moving beyond the political halls and legal precedents, Watergate left just an immense cultural footprint, didn't it?
Oh, massive. All the President's Men, the book, and then the movie, it basically defined what investigative journalism looked like on screen for generations. It influenced countless journalists and filmmakers. You can see its DNA in later works, like the Oscar-winning film Spotlight.
And the ubiquity of the scandal itself was incredible. It just seeped immediately into popular culture, didn't it?
Instantly. The political paranoia, the catchphrases, the sheer absurdity of some of the characters and events became cultural shorthand almost overnight. Watergate references found their way into everything, even children's television. You mentioned Sesame Street earlier. There's a famous skit where Cookie Monster stands accused of stealing cookies, and he uses the classic White House Stonewall defense, claiming he could not recollect at this point in time what happened to the missing baked goods.
Amazing. And internationally, too.
Oh yeah, the fascination was just as intense globally. The Clash's Joe Strummer kind of summed up the global fatigue and fascination when he sang, "Never mind the stars and stripes, let's print the Watergate tapes,"
Yeah.
demonstrating how quickly the scandal became synonymous worldwide with American political corruption and dysfunction.
Finally, looking at its legacy today, the sources frequently, and I think naturally, draw comparisons between Watergate and subsequent political crises, perhaps most notably the events surrounding January 6th.
The common thread identified in both episodes, separated by nearly half a century, seems to be this underlying thirst for power and a president attempting to do an end run around democracy, essentially using the power of the office to try and subvert electoral or institutional outcomes they don't like.
But the sources stress a massive fundamental difference between the two eras, and this feels like the most relevant modern echo, doesn't it?
It does. The key difference highlighted is this. During Watergate, the bipartisan institutions, however flawed, ultimately worked. The Senate Watergate Committee, remember, was established by that stunning 77-0 unanimous vote. It was led by respected figures from both parties, like Democrat Sam Ervin and Republican Howard Baker, who demonstrated a willingness to cross party lines to expose the truth and defend the Constitution.
Whereas today,
Today, the institutional checks required for that kind of accountability face severe and often crippling partisan division. The sources note, for example, that the later January 6th committee was formed on a much narrower, largely party-line vote. It lacked the kind of unanimous, cross-party consensus that gave the Watergate investigation its unquestioned political legitimacy and broad public acceptance. That decline in institutional cross-party integrity, that willingness to put country over party, is perhaps the biggest, most worrying modern warning sign emanating from the Watergate-era's legacy.
this has been a necessary and I think deeply detailed dive into one of the most complex and consequential political sagas in U.S. history. Watergate, it seems, was ultimately a logical, if horrifying, culmination of a deep-seated political mindset, one fueled by paranoia, resentment, and a conviction that the presidency was constantly under siege.
And that mindset was enabled by secret internal systems like the taping system, ironically, that Nixon installed himself, thinking it would protect his legacy.
And it was ultimately exposed and restrained, thankfully, by the enduring strength of the courts, the Senate, and a truly tenacious, dedicated press.
What's really fascinating here, though, connecting back to our opening point about the evolving story, is the perspective offered by historians now, with access to all the accumulated information 50 years later. One of the great maxims we all learned about Watergate was that the cover-up was worse than the original crime, the burglary itself.
Right, that was a common wisdom.
But based on the newer revelations about the sheer extent of the criminality that preceded the DNC, breaking the full scope of the Plimmers operations, the genuinely considered suggestions of assassination and bombing, the concerted attempts to sabotage democratic elections, our sources strongly suggest that the original systemic crimes of the Nixon White House might actually have been far more terrible, far more extensive, and potentially far more dangerous to the Republic than we fully understood at the time of the resignation. The cover-up was terrible, but the underlying rot was profound.
That raises the final, really critical question for us and for you listening. The constitutional crisis was only fully resolved, the truth only fully confirmed, because Nixon himself was this meticulous, if paranoid recorder who wanted to preserve his version of history, leading him to install that voice-activated taping system.
And it took a unanimous Supreme Court ruling to compel the release of those specific incriminating physical recordings. The audio evidence was undeniable.
So the question is, if the smoking gun tape hadn't been created, if Nixon had, say, utilized a system that didn't leave a clear, uneditable audio record that could be subpoenaed and compelled by the Supreme Court, would we ever have known the full extent of the criminality and his direct personal involvement?
And the question for you to consider, thinking about today, is this. If a modern executive abuses power but does so without creating that kind of physical, uneditable record that the courts can definitively compel, what does that suggest about the fragility of transparency and accountability in the executive branch today, when our reliance might shift more towards institutional integrity and witness testimony rather than incontrovertible physical evidence? Is that enough? That's something to mull over as we continue to grapple with Watergate's long, haunting legacy.